this little program that we're going to do tonight, you're going to get a bite-sized history of Hollywood censorship and Chicago's role in the matter. So I'm Kelly. I run Chicago movie tours. If you're interested in other Chicago and film related events, some of which I'll post on the I'll put online in just a second after we finish, check out chicagomovietours.com or follow along on social media at Shy Movie Tours. So my goal is pretty simple. It's to help you discover Chicago through film. And we're going to do that a bit tonight, but we're going to actually start in Hollywood. So let's do that. So then we're going to move back to Chicago. Now, one of the most recognizable aspects of Hollywood is its sign. Now, what you're looking at on your screen right now is the first iteration of the Hollywood sign, and you can see that it says Hollywood Land. And this was erected in 1923, and it was there to promote the name of a new housing development out in Los Angeles called Hollywood Land. And the sign did not achieve its normal status, or what you're probably most familiar with, until 1949. So from the earliest days of film, though, community and church leaders fought against the distribution of moving pictures out here in Hollywood. Through the 1910s, movies had gained significant influence in the United States, and theaters like the ones that you're seeing on your screen now were basically dedicated to showing moving pictures. You can see there all day, every day, right? Matinees for 25 cents on the right-hand side of your screen, for example. So dedicated to showing moving pictures. So these messages and the reputation of Hollywood, the messages that they were putting out and the reputation of Hollywood were constantly coming under attack. And there are a few reasons for these attacks, and we're going to look at 4 of those tonight, starting with Nickelodeons as number 1. Now, in a previous tour of mine, maybe you'll remember this, we walked through Chicago's uptown neighborhood as we're doing now. This is down Lawrence Avenue, and we're headed toward the CTA station. And ultimately on this virtual tour, we get to a theater called the Lakeside Theater. But as we were doing this on our virtual tour, we talked about cheap theaters. And these were also referred to not only as cheap theaters, but as nickel theaters, as 5-cent theaters, Nickelodeons, nickel dumps, and in some ways, vicious theaters, or in some newspapers, I should say, vicious theaters. So lots of ways to describe cheap theaters, some of which are not very positive, of course. So the nickel movie theaters, like you're looking at here, boasted cheap prices of 5 cents admission, hence the name Nickelodeon. See the blue arrows there where you have admission showing you 5 cents to get in here. So theaters like these, Nickelodeons, were really popular with immigrants and working class who did not have a lot of extra money for entertainment purposes. So for these groups of people, like the ones that you see coming off the boat here, Nickelodeons, these very cheap movie theaters, represented a moment of pleasure away from the harsh working conditions in which they found themselves for the majority of the week. The Nickelodeon was also an opportunity for community, for these immigrants and working class folks to kind of get together and take a load off, you might say. So they were not only cheap, they were also accessible. So I have some figures for you here. Look at these. In 1907, we had roughly 150 cheap theaters in the Chicago area. By that same time the next year, in 1908, it had doubled to 300 cheap theaters or Nickelodeon theaters in the Chicago area. Now in Chicago, the daily attendance at these around this time period was 200,000 people a day. Nationwide, it was about 2 million. So lots of Chicagoans, working class immigrants and otherwise, were definitely watching movies in the early part of the 20th century. And immigrants, like the ones that you see on the right-hand side of your screen, you have to remember, spoke little to no English, and they had, as I mentioned a moment ago, very little money for other entertainment forms. And also, immigrants like this Albanian woman, she didn't need to speak English to watch a silent movie, right? You're still going to laugh at Charlie Chaplin falling down or slipping on a banana peel or roller skating. You don't have to speak English in order to find that humorous. So the success of these cheap theaters was linked to a massive influx of immigrants into Chicago. And while working class and immigrant Chicagoans like these on the left-hand side of your screen really loved these cheap theaters, these middle-class Chicagoans right below me detested these cheap theaters. They also did not like what the theaters were showing, which they thought were immoral and indecent images. And that basically boils down to four things: robbery, murder, crime, and sex. Sex being a big one, which we'll find out in just a second. So for example, here are some images that would have been shocking to the middle-class Chicagoans who did not like these cheap theaters. So this is a promotional photo on the far left of your screen of Joan Blondell, actress. This photo was later actually banned. You also have on the top right-hand corner a man in a movie kissing a 15-year-old Loretta Young's foot in 1928, which would have been extremely risque. And then on the bottom right-hand corner, you have gangster movies like The Public Enemy from 1931 with Jimmy Cagney down there. But these films were featuring criminals as heroes, or we might say today, anti-heroes, right? So these things were not very appealing to the middle-class Chicagoans who did not like these cheap theaters. So let's look at a few headlines here of the time period. Traces crime to nickel theater. Would suppress vicious theaters. And then look at the smaller print on the bottom newspaper article there. The hold of moving picture shows on the children. Results of an investigation by the Chicago City Club. Countrywide problem. So middle-class Chicagoans were singling out these small movie houses, these Nickelodeons, claiming that the movies they were showing were a technology that lured innocent children, women, and immigrants into a life of sin. They said, for example, these theaters caused more juvenile crime than all the other bad influences put together. They were contaminating the tender minds of the children. Their imaginations, for goodness sake, are being debauched. So these dark, hot, think Chicago summers, and potentially dangerous cheap theaters was one reason that certain community members were quite concerned about Hollywood at this point. So a second reason, we'll use these two people as an example. Hollywood scandals. So we have Nickelodeons or cheap theaters and Hollywood scandals in the cinema's early days. So on the left, we have Fatty Arbuckle. This is a comedic actor who was ultimately accused of the rape and murder of a fellow silent film actress named Virginia Rappe. You have on the right-hand side of your screen Olive Thomas, who was a silent film actress who was poisoned or potentially overdosed on her husband's syphilis medication and died. Also, lots of cocaine use in Hollywood during this early silent era as well, which was not making the industry look really pleasing to those middle-class Chicagoans. So again, two reasons people were concerned about Hollywood: those cheap theaters and Hollywood scandals. You also have number three, racist depictions like The Birth of a Nation on the left-hand side of your screen, represented by that poster there, which is a movie that is basically asking you to root for the KKK. You also have number four, immoral representations on screen, which we kind of touched on a little bit earlier. But here we have a full-out orgy, right? We have orgies, naked characters, adultery, all of these kinds of things that people were very up in arms about. So the film that you're looking at on the right-hand side is called Manslaughter from 1922, wherein you have these men plundering a room of women, as you can see the result of there. And then there's also an erotic kiss that's shown between two members of the same sex in that movie as well. So quite risque at the time. But by the early 1920s, there were calls for senators, like in this room here, to conduct an investigation into the political activities of Hollywood. And by 1922, to thwart these investigations and these accusations, the movie studios brought in this guy, former Postmaster General of the United States, Will Hayes. And they brought him in to really handle three things. Number one, to monitor the effects of movies on growing audiences. Again, looking specifically at children, minorities, and immigrants, because that's who the society and community thought were the most susceptible to Hollywood's bad moving pictures. So Mr. Hayes was brought in to monitor the effects of movies on audiences. Number two, he was brought in to regulate the movie's moral content. Let's put some stuff on this screen that we can be proud of. Not orgies, not adultery, not anti-heroes. And number three, Mr. Hayes was there to reorient the industry's image. So he was going to do this so that no outside bodies could enforce censorship on Hollywood. We don't want the government to get involved, so let's just handle this ourselves. So, Mr. Hayes and his office attempted to clean up Hollywood with various codes and rules in the late 1920s and early 1930s, but they really just kind of functioned as suggestions. In 1932, this guy, Joseph Breen, who was a journalist and a very influential Catholic in the country, he arrives in Hollywood. So by 1934, Joseph Breen, in cahoots with a lot of other higher-up Catholics, by the way, starts cleaning up Hollywood while running something called the Production Code Administration. You can see the Production Code and Mr. Breen there on the newspaper or the Industry magazine article on the right. So he created this office called the Production Code Administration to enforce something called the Production Code of 1934. It's also referred to as the Motion Picture Production Code, the Hayes Code, so named for our friend Will Hayes. But nonetheless, it is, as you can see from the title on the far left-hand side of your screen, it is a code to govern the making of motion pictures and the reasons supporting it and the resolution for uniform interpretation. So basically then, this is a series of guidelines for filmmakers and producers to follow, a strict set of guidelines for them to follow. So with Mr. Breen down there in charge, no film could be shown in the United States in a theater without the stamp of approval right next to my head there from the Production Code Administration. And you can see that stamp, and what's written on top of it says this picture was approved by the Production Code Administration of the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America. So every movie had to have this stamp of approval through the Production Code. And any producer attempting to skirt this or to do otherwise was going to be fined a fee of at least $25,000. So here are the opening credits of Casablanca, for example. And you can see in the bottom right-hand corner down here, the stamp of approval from the Production Code Administration building, not building, but the Production Code Administration on the right-hand side of the screen there, saying that Casablanca has gone through these strictures and rules and it has been approved. So you might be asking at this point, what was in this censorship code or this production code of 1934? So let's start with a few things. Number one, the technique of murder must be presented in a way that will not inspire imitation. So you cannot show, for example, how to successfully load a gun, point a gun, and kill someone there. You don't want to have that so that someone cannot mimic it in real life, for example. Here's another one. In general, where essential to the plot, scenes of passion should not be presented in such a way as to arouse or excite the passions of the ordinary spectator. So you shouldn't have too much sexiness going on screen because that could potentially lead to sexiness in the theater itself, and we certainly don't want that. Another rule from the Production Code of 1934, excessive and lustful kissing, lustful embraces, suggestive postures, and gestures are not to be shown. Another one, pointed profanity. This includes the words God, Lord, Jesus Christ, unless it's used reverently, hell, SOB, damn, and God, or every other profane or vulgar expression, however used, is forbidden. And I have up here an image from Gone with the Wind, and I put that up there on purpose because I am guessing that most of you know the most famous line from this film. Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn. Now, this film was put out when the production code was very much in effect, and it uses the word damn. So it's not to say that every single film followed these things to a T. There were some exceptions to the rules, like Gone with the Wind, for example, which fought hard to keep that line and that word damn in there. Another rule, miscegenation or sex between blacks and whites is forbidden. You also have sexual hygiene and venereal diseases not to be subjects for your motion pictures. Scenes of actual childbirth, whether in fact or in silhouette, are never to be presented, and children's sex organs are never to be exposed. So, we have several things, and this is perhaps my favorite. Dancing in general is recognized as an art and a beautiful form of expressing human emotions, but dances which suggest or represent sexual actions, whether performed solo with two or more, dances intended to excite the emotional reaction of an audience, dances with movement of the breast, excessive body movements while the feet are stationary, violate decency, and are wrong. That is a very specific ruling for film musicals at the time period, right? So here is a scene from Martin Scorsese's film called The Aviator. And let's see if it'll play for you here. Let's see. Whoops, there we go. So in this movie, The Aviator, Leonardo DiCaprio is playing eccentric film producer Howard Hughes. Here he comes in the door, who has to go to Joseph Breen and the production code, who are sitting at this table, to get one of his films past the Hayes office. So you have these very sullen guys that are standing up there just with DiCaprio's character trying to present why he should be able to have his film pass through here, and they do not abide by this at all. So check out that scene. That's a pretty interesting example of how it might have worked whenever a filmmaker or a producer was going into the production code office to get his or her film passed there. So this is not to say that people like Howard Hughes didn't try to push through images that would challenge the code. There were definitely people who did that, and sometimes it went right past the guys who were stamping the code of approval on there. For example, here's my friend Gene Kelly. This is a film called The Pirate, and Gene Kelly is dressed as a pirate here, and he is supposed to be hypnotizing Judy Garland's character. So as he is kissing her to hypnotize her, watch his right hand and what it does. All right, so hopefully you saw that. We have a little bit of a boob graze there, if you want to use those terms, which would, of course, not have been allowed under the Production Code Administration in 1948 when this film came out. But nonetheless, somebody wasn't paying attention, and there it was in there. But let's return to Chicago for a moment, and we looked at these headlines a few minutes ago. And in 1907, we know that reformers in Chicago tried to regulate these cheap nickel theaters. We know that they singled out these small movie houses, claiming it was a technology that lured innocent children, women, and immigrants into a life of sin. At this time, Chicago was also one of the first cities to censor movies. So let's look at this clipping here from 1914. Just the part that's highlighted there. Aside from this one example, talking about Ohio above us, all the censoring is being done by municipalities under police power. And even that effort is largely confined to Chicago. So who is censoring films in Chicago during cinema's early days? It's the Chicago police. So here are some of the Chicago police of that time. So the city council put the chief of police in charge of giving permits to exhibitors, or those people who could screen movies. And if the Chicago police denied the exhibitor a permit, he or she would have to edit the movie to meet the standards of the censor, or remove the movie from the theater altogether. So Chicago police, what they would do would give out these little pink permits to designate movies that were limited to adult viewing. Well, think about that. That policy is going to backfire spectacularly, because these pink permits floating all around the city of Chicago in people's hands and on the ground, that's just advertising movies rather than penalizing movies with these salacious titles or the salacious material in them. So that kind of backfires spectacularly on these guys, and people with the little pink permits. They're like, well, that's a movie that I want to go see. So they would head directly to the theater and go watch it. So that's early silent cinema, before Hollywood had put in place the Production Code of 1934, which we might ask at this point, whatever happened to this thing? Because this is not around anymore, right? Well, that's true. And in the 1950s, the Production Code, the Motion Picture Production Code, is basically hanging on by a thread for a few reasons. Number one, there was a court decision in 1948, a Supreme Court decision, that declared the major studios like MGM, 20th Century Fox, Warner Brothers declared them a monopoly, and they ran everything. They ran the production, the distribution, and the exhibition of films. And so the court said, you are a monopoly and you have to be disbanded. So that starts to make the studios sort of fall by the wayside, and that production code is going to be a part of that, of course. So that's one reason that we don't have the production code anymore. A second one, look at the bottom left-hand corner there. We have new, cool, hip Italian and French foreign movies that are coming into Hollywood, not bound in any way by the strictures of the Hays Code. They're showing sex, they're showing violence, they're showing real things. So these movies are now coming into Hollywood and are starting to compete with Hollywood's films of the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And then, of course, right underneath my head there, a new way to watch moving pictures, television, had emerged by this point. So people are saying, I'm not going to go out into the city and watch a movie when I can have moving pictures right here in my home. So all of these things combined are helping to push the production code further and further away. So by the 1950s, you have increasingly much more explicit films coming out of Hollywood that begin to deal with adult subjects and sexual matters that really had not been seen in Hollywood since before 1934, when that Hays Code started its effect. So on the left up there at the top, you have Psycho, which is a movie all about sex and violence. You have The Moon is Blue on the bottom left-hand corner there, which has discussions about abortion in it. You also have Some Like It Hot right there next to me, where you have men dressed in drag. So eventually then, this production code is going to start falling by the wayside, and Hollywood's going to have to figure out how to censor itself in other ways. So that brings us to probably what you're more familiar with, which is the rating system. So by 1968, the Hays Code is dead and replaced by this, the MPAA rating system, which has changed in various ways over the years. So we have G, we have PG, we have PG-13, which did not happen until 84, I think. There's R, there's NC-17, there used to be X, so there's been some variations of this, of course. But this is an industry board that rates movies really according to graphic content, mostly having to do with sex, not so much violence here in the United States. And eventually we have these ratings like the ones that you've seen, which have several changes over the years. So that's where the production code went, and this is what has kind of replaced it as far as a censorship within Hollywood. So one last piece of Chicagoan film censorship history before we go that's quite fun. This is a DVD case. So the front and the back of it, and it's to a movie called Devil Times 5. And you can also see on the bottom left-hand side of your screen that it was also released in two other titles, The Horrible House on the Hill and People Toys. So let's look at the back of the DVD case on the right-hand side of your screen, and we're going to read the summary up to a part. So it says, on an icy California road, a speeding transport van crashes down a hillside. 5 survivors, children, climb out and trek to a secluded mansion where a ruthless businessman is convening with family and associates. Psychotics from a mental hospital, the kids, proceed to put the dead in dead of winter, murdering their hosts one by one. So this is a 1970s exploitation film. Let me show you part of the trailer really quickly.
People. Little people.
If you take them in, you'll be taken in. Because there is no way to survive the Devil Times 5.
What about those kids?
You gotta be kidding.
Whatever you think they are, they're not. Whatever you think they won't do, they will.
Ooh, you got to watch out for those kids, don't you? Okay, let's go back to the DVD and finish reading what I did not read a moment ago. So the last sentence. This nasty piece of 1970s shock cinema was kept out of general release in Chicago by the city's police department. So this is 1970s, right? So, all right, I have some bullet points over here. So let me tell you the story of this, and you can follow along there on the left-hand side of your screen. So this movie, Devil Times 5, was scheduled to be distributed at 40 different venues in and around the Chicago area in April of 1978. However, the Chicago Police Department, bullet number 2 here, the review board of the Chicago Police Department voted to deny a permit for the film's screening, claiming, number 3, it was excessively violent and inappropriate for minors, forcing the distributor to release the movie as X-rated to Chicago, despite the fact that it had already been approved as an R-rated film. Now, if you don't know, an X-rated movie, that's not going to get any advertisement, and only certain people are going to be allowed to be in the theater. So it's not going to have nearly the reach as an R-rated movie. So this is really bad to the distributor and the filmmaker here. Nonetheless, the distributors said, no, Chicago. So the city had to seek an injunction in circuit court that prohibited minors from viewing this movie. So number 4, bullet point, Chicago was the only U.S. city at the time with an ordinance for this kind of film censorship. And the Chicago judge did uphold the ordinance, so the movie could not be shown to minors. So from the early 1900s all the way up to roughly 1978, you have the Chicago police dabbling ever so gingerly in Hollywood film and what you can and cannot see at the theater itself. So there you go, a little bit of history on Chicago movies and censorship. So you get the little bite-sized history starting with Nickelodeon's Immigrants, Working Class, and how all of that worked and really freaked people out in the early 1900s. Hopefully you learned a little bit more about the Production Code of 1934, the Hays Code, which is a fascinating subject to delve into in cinema history. And you now know why the code fell by the wayside. We have TV, we have fancy foreign films, we have the Paramount decision of 1948, and then now we have the rating system that is replacing that censorship ruling from 1934. And you know perhaps a little bit more about Chicago's participation in some of these events.